Hello, Jennifer back again. I'm going to be reading the second part of Training in Christianity. I think there will be a part 3, possibly a part 4. We'll have to see how it goes. Before we continue forward, I wanted to review a couple sentences at the end of my last reading. The invitation halts at the parting of ways, where the path of sin again veers for the last time and is lost to view in perdition. O turn about, come hither. Shrink not at the difficulty of the journey back, however hard it may be. Fear not the toilsome path of conversion, however laboriously it leads to salvation. Whereas sin with winged speed and ever-increasing velocity leads onward or downward, so easily, with such indescribable ease, as easily indeed as when a horse, relieved entirely of the strain of pulling, cannot with all his might bring the wagon to a halt which thrusts him over into the abyss. Be not in despair at every relapse which the God of patience possesses patience enough to forgive, and which a sinner might well have patience enough to be humbled under. Nay, fear nothing and despair not. He who says, "Come hither," is with you on your way. From him come help and forgiveness and the path of conversion, which leads to him, and with him there is rest. And I wanted to also read to you a footnote that I thought was neat. At the line where it says, "Shrink not the difficulty of the journey back, however hard it be." The footnote begins SK, which is how Soren Kierkegaard is being referred to by Brittal, the editor. SK, during his own laborious return from the path of perdition, remarked that one was compelled to tread backwards the whole way one had gone, and he remembered a fairy tale which recounted that deliverance from an enchantment wrought by a piece of music was possible only when one was able to play it backwards without an error. So the backwards playing, I think, is interesting. Okay, so I will read the next line and then we'll begin going forward. Nay, fear nothing and despair not. He who says, "Come hither," is with you on your way. From him come help and forgiveness in the path of conversion, which leads to him, and with him there is rest. Come hither all of you, with him is rest. And he makes no difficulties. He does but one thing, he opens his arms. He will not first, as righteous people do, alas, even when they are willing to help, he will not first ask thee, "Art thou not after all to blame for thy misfortune? Hast thou in fact no cause for self-reproach?" It is so easy, so human to judge after the outward appearance, after the result, when a person is a cripple or deformed or has an unprepossessing appearance, to judge that ergo he is a bad man. When a person fares badly in the world so that he is brought to ruin or goes downhill, then to judge that ergo he is a vicious man. Oh, it is such an exquisite invention of cruel pleasure to enhance the consciousness of one's own righteousness in contrast with the sufferer, by explaining that his suffering is God's condigned punishment, so that one hardly even dares to help him, or by challenging him with that condemning question which flatters one's own righteousness in the very act of helping him. But he will put no such questions to thee. He will not be thy benefactor in so cruel a fashion. If thou thyself art conscious of being a sinner, he will not inquire of thee about it. The bruised reed he will not further break, but he will raise thee up if thou wilt attach himself to him. He will not single thee out by contrast, holding thee apart from him, so that thy sin will seem still more dreadful. He will grant thee hiding place within him, and once hidden in him, he will hide thy sins. for he is the friend of sinners. When it is in question of a sinner, he does not merely stand, open his arms and say, "Come hither." No, he stands there and waits, as the father of the lost son waited. Rather, he does not stand and wait. He goes forth to seek, as the shepherd sought the lost sheep, as the woman sought the lost coin. He goes, yet no, he has gone, but infinitely farther than any shepherd or any woman. He went, in sooth, the infinitely long way from being God to becoming man. And that way he went in search of sinners. This is part 3. Come hither to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Come hither, for he assumes that thy labor are heavy laden, feel the burden all too heavy, the labor heavy, and now stand in perplexity, heaving sighs, one glancing around scarcely to see if no help is to be found, another with eyes bent down upon the ground, because he has described no comfort, a third gazing upward as though from heaven it still must come, but all of them seeking. Therefore, he says, come hither, him who has ceased to seek, and to sorrow he does not invite. Come hither, for he, the inviter, knows it is a sign of true suffering that one goes apart to brood alone in disconsolate silence, lacking the courage to confide in anyone, not to say the confidence to hope for help. Alas, that demoniac was not the only person possessed by a dumb spirit. Suffering, which does not begin by making the sufferer dumb, does not amount to much, no more than love, which does not make the lover silent. Sufferers whose tongues run easily over the story of their sufferings, neither labor nor heavy laden. Lo, for this reason the inviter dare not wait till they that labor and are heavy laden come to him of their own accord. He himself lovingly summons them. All his willingness to help would perhaps be no help at all if he did not utter this word and thereby take the first step. For in this summons, come unto me, it is he, in fact, who comes to them. O human compassion, perhaps it may sometimes indicate praiseworthy self-restraint, perhaps also sometimes a genuine and heartfelt sympathy, when thou refrainest from questioning a man who, as he may be surmised, is constantly brooding over hidden suffering. Yet how often it may be only worldly wisdom, which has no desire to learn to know too much. O human compassion, how often was it merely curiosity, not compassion, which prompted thee to venture to penetrate the sufferer's secret? And what a burden didst thou feel it to be, almost a punishment upon thy curiosity, when he followed thine invitation and came to thee. But he who utters this saving word, come hither, was not deceived in himself when he uttered the word, neither will he deceive thee when thou comest to him, to find rest by casting thy burden upon him. He follows the prompting of his heart in uttering it, and his heart accompanies and follows the word. Follow then thou the word, and it will accompany or follow thee back to his heart. It is a matter of course. The one thing follows the other. Oh, that thou wouldst follow the invitation. Come hither, for he assumes that they that labor are heavy laden and so tired and exhausted in a state of swoon that they have forgotten again, as in a stupor, that there is comfort. Or alas, he knows that it is only too true that there is no comfort and help unless it is sought in him, and so he has to call them to come hither. Come hither, for it is characteristic of every society that it possesses a token or a sign of some sort by which one who is a member can be recognized. When a young girl is adorned in a certain manner, one knows that she is on her way to a ball. Come hither, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. Come hither. Thou dost not need to wear a distinctive outward and visible mark. Come also with anointed head and face newly washed, if thou dost inwardly labor and art heavy laden. Come hither, O stand not still considering the matter. Consider rather, O consider that for every instant thou standest still after hearing the invitation, thou wilt in the next instant hear its call fainter and fainter, and thus be withdrawing to a distance, though thou be standing at the same spot. Come hither, O however tired and weary thou art with thy labor, or with the long, long quest in search of help and salvation, although it seem to thee as if thou couldst not follow one step farther or hold out a minute longer without sinking to the ground. Oh, but this one step more, and here it is. Rest, come hither. And if thou were only one so wretched that he could not come, a sigh is enough. To sigh for him is also to come hither. The obstacle. Come hither unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. I will give you rest. Halt now, but what is there to impose a halt? That which in a single instant infinitely alters everything, so that in reality, instead of getting a sight, as one might expect, of an interminable throng of such as labor and are heavy laden following the invitation, you behold in fact a sight which is exactly the opposite, an interminable throng of men who turn backward in flight and shudder, until in the scramble to get away they trample one another underfoot, so that if from the result one to infer what had been said, one must conclude that the words were procul o procul este profani, rather than come hither. Fly, and that is procul o procul este profani. Oh, I'm sorry if my pronunciation is terrible. I'm working on it. That means far away, be far away, ye profane, which I knew part of, but anyhow. Not as though he were not the man to do what he says, or not God to keep the promise he has made. No, in a sense very different from that. In the sense, namely, that the inviter is and insists upon being the definite historical person he was 1800 years ago, and that as his definite person living under the conditions he then lived under, he uttered those words of invitation. He is not, for nobody is he willing to be, one about whom we have learned to know something merely from history, i.e. world history, secular history, in contrast to sacred history. For from history we can learn to know nothing about him, because there is absolutely nothing that can be known about him. He declines to be judged in a human way by the consequences of his life. That is to say, he is and would be the sign of offense and the object of faith. To judge him by the consequences of his life is mere mockery of God. For seeing that he is God, his life, the life which he actually lived in time, is infinitely more important than all the consequences of it in the course of history. A. Who spoke these words of invitation? The inviter. Who is the inviter? Jesus Christ. Which Jesus Christ? The Jesus Christ who sits in glory at the right hand of the Father? No. From the seat of his glory he has not spoken one word. Therefore it is Jesus Christ in his humiliation, in the state of humiliation, who spoke these words. Is then Jesus Christ not always the same? Yes, he is the same, yesterday and today, the same that 1800 years ago humbled himself and took upon him the form of a servant. The Jesus Christ who uttered these words of invitation. In his coming again in glory, he is again the same Jesus Christ, but this has not yet occurred. Is he then not now in glory? Yes, indeed. This is the Christian believes, but it was in the state of humiliation he uttered these words. From the seat of his glory he has not uttered them. and about his coming again in glory nothing can be known. In the strictest sense, it can only be believed. But one cannot have become a Christian without having already come to him in his estate of humiliation, without having come to him, who is the sign of offense and the object of faith. In no otherwise does he exist on earth, for it was only thus that he existed. That he shall come in glory is to be expected, but it can be expected and believed only by one who has attached himself and continues to hold fast to him as he actually exists. Jesus Christ is the same, but he lived 1800 years ago in his humiliation and first becomes changed for us with his coming again. As yet he has not returned, so he remains still the lowly one, about whom it is believed that he shall return in glory. What he said and taught, every word he has spoken, becomes eo ipso untrue when we make it appear as if Christ in glory who says it. No, he maintains silence. It is the lowly one who speaks. The interval between his humiliation and his coming again in glory, which is the moment, is about 1800 years, and may possibly be protracted to many times 1800. This interval, rather, all that as interval makes of him, secular history and church history, with all the worldly information they furnish about Christ, about who Christ was, and consequently about who uttered these words, is a thing completely indifferent, neither here nor there, which merely distorts him, and thereby renders these words of invitation untrue. For it is untruth if I imaginatively ascribe to a man words which he never uttered, affirming that he said them, but it is also untruth if I imaginatively represent him as essentially different from what he was when he spake certain words. I say essentially different, for a falsehood which has to do only with some accidental trait does not make it untrue that he said the thing. And so, when God is pleased to walk here on earth in a strict incognito, such as only an almighty being can assume, an incognito impenetrable to the most intimate observation, when it pleases him to come in the lowly form of a servant, to all appearance like any other man, and why he does it, with what purpose, he surely knows best, but whatever the reason or purpose may be, they testify that the incognito has some essential significance. When it pleases him to come in this lowly form to teach men, and then somebody repeats exactly the words he utters, but makes it appear as if it was God who said them, the thing becomes untrue, for it is untrue that he uttered these words. B. Can one learn from history anything about Christ? No. Why not? Because one can know nothing at all about Christ. He is the paradox, the object of faith, existing only for faith. But all historical communication is communication of knowledge. Hence, from history one can learn nothing about Christ, for if one learns little or much about him, or anything at all, he, who is thus known, is not he who in truth he is, i.e., one learns to know nothing about him, or one learns to know something incorrect about him, one is deceived. History makes out Christ to be another that he truly is, and so one learns to know a lot about Christ. No, not about Christ, for about him nothing can be known, he can only be believed. C. Can one prove from history that Christ was God? Let me first put another question. Is it possible to conceive of a more foolish contradiction than that of wanting to prove, no matter for the present purpose, whether it be from history or from anything else in the wide world, one wants to prove it, that a definite individual man is God? That an individual man is God, declares himself to be God, is indeed the offense par excellence. Sorry, it was in Greek. But what is the offense, the offensive thing? What is the variance with human reason? And such a thing as that one would attempt to prove. To prove is to demonstrate something to be rational reality it is. Be the rational reality it is. Can one demonstrate that to be a rational reality which is at variance with reason? Surely not, unless one would contradict himself. One can prove only that it is a variance with reason. The proofs which Scripture presents for Christ's divinity, his miracles, his resurrection from the dead, his ascension into heaven, are therefore only for faith. That is, they are not proofs. They have no intention of proving that all these agrees perfectly with reason. On the contrary, they would prove that it conflicts with reason and therefore is an object of faith. But return to the proof from history. Is it not 1800 years since Christ lived? Is not his name proclaimed and believed on throughout the whole world? Has not his doctrine, Christianity, changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeating all relationships, and in this way has not history abundantly and more than abundantly established who he was, namely that he was God? No history has not established that, either abundantly or more than abundantly. That is something which history in all eternity cannot establish. So far, however, as the first assertion is concerned, it is sure enough that his name is proclaimed in all the world. Whether it is believed on, I will not decide. It is sure enough that Christianity has changed the face of the world, triumphantly permeating all relationships, so triumphantly that all now say that they are Christians. But what does that prove? At the most, it might prove that Jesus Christ was a great man, perhaps the greatest of all, but that he was God? Nay, stop there. The conclusion shall by God's help never be drawn. If, in order to lead up to this conclusion, one begins with the assumption that Jesus Christ was a man, and then considers the history of the 1800 years, the consequence of his life, one may conclude with an ascending superlative scale, great, greater, greatest, exceedingly, and astonishingly the greatest man that ever lived. If, on the contrary, one begins with the assumption of faith, that he was God, one has thereby annulled the 1800 years of having nothing to do with the case, proving that pro non contraire, inasmuch as the certitude of faith is something infinitely higher, and it is in one or the other of these ways one must begin. If one begins in the latter way, everything is as it should be. If one begins in the first way, one cannot, without being guilty at one point or another of a kind, arrive at suddenly by an inference at the new quality, God, as if the consequence or the consequences of a man life might suddenly furnish the proof that this man was God. If this could be done, then one might answer the following query: what consequences must there be? How great the effects produced? How many centuries must elapse in order to establish a proof from the consequences of a man's life? This being the assumption that he was God, whether perhaps it might be said in the year 300 Christ was not yet completely proved to be God, something approaching that having been attained, namely, that he was already a little more than the exceedingly astonishingly greatest man that ever lived, but there still was need of several centuries more? If such be the case, the further consequence presumably follows that they who lived in the year 300 did not regard Christ as God, and still less they who lived in the first century, whereas, on the other hand, the certitude that he is God increases regularly with each century. So, in our time, the 19th century, it is greater than it has ever been before, a certitude in comparison with which the first century seemed barely to have glimpsed his divinity. One may make answer to this or leave it alone. It makes no essential difference. What can this mean? Is it possible that by contemplating the consequences of something as they unfold themselves more and more, one might, by a simple inference from them, produce another quality different from that contained in the assumption. It is not a sign of insanity, supposing man in general to be sane, that the first proposition, the assumption by which one starts out with, is so far astray about what is what that it errs to the extent of the whole quality. And when one begins with this error, how shall one at any subsequent point be able to perceive the mistake and apprehend that one is dealing with another and an infinitely different quality? The print of a foot along a path is obviously a consequence of the fact that some creature has gone that way. I may now go on to suppose erroneously that it was, for example, a bird, but on closer inspection, pursuing the track farther, I convince myself that it must have been another sort of animal. Very well, but there we are, far from having an infinite qualitative alteration. But can I, by a closer inspection of such a track, or by following it farther, reach at one point or another the conclusion, ergo, it was a spirit that passed this way, a spirit which leaves no trace behind it? Just so it was with this thing of concluding from the consequences of an assumed human existence that ergo it was God. Do God and men resemble one another to such a degree? Is there so slight a difference between them that I suppose I am not crazy, can begin with the assumption that Christ was a man? And on the other hand, has not Christ himself said he was God? If God and men resemble one another to that degree, if they have that degree of kinship, and thus essentially are included in the same quality, the conclusion, ergo it was God, is nevertheless humbug. For if God is nothing else than that, then God doesn't exist at all. But if God exists, and consequently is distinguished by an infinite difference of quality from all that it means to be a man, then neither can I nor anybody else, by beginning with the assumption that he was a man, arrive at all eternity at the conclusion, therefore it was God. Everyone who has the least dialectical training can easily perceive that the whole argument about consequences is incommensurable with the decision of the question whether it is God, and that this decisive question is presented to men in an entirely different form. Whether he will believe that he is what he said he was, or whether he will not believe. This ought to be enough to throw a spike into the gears of the argument from the consequences of Christ's life, ergo he was God. But faith in the province of his jurisdiction raises a still more essential protest against every attempt to approach Christ by the help of what one happens to know of him through history and the information history has preserved about the consequences of his life. Faith's contention is that this whole attempt is blasphemy. Faith's contention is that the one and the only proof which unbelief allowed to stand when it demolished all the other proofs of truth of Christianity, the proof which unbelief itself discovered. Yes, the situation is curiously complicated, which unbelief discovered and discovered as a proof of the truth of Christianity. Mighty good, unbelief discovers proof in defense of Christianity. The proof which Christendom has since made so much ado about, the proof of the 1800 years, faith's contention is that it is blasphemy. In the case of a man, it may justly enough be said that consequences of his life are more important than his life. When a person then seeks to find out who Christ was, and essays to draw a logical conclusion from the consequences of his life, he makes him out eo ipso to be a man who, like other men, has to pass his examination in history. History, says Faith, has nothing whatever to do with Christ. As applying to him, we have only sacred history, qualitative difference from history in general, which recounts the story of his life under the conditions of his humiliation, and reports, moreover, that he himself said that he was God. He is the paradox, which history can never digest or convert into a common syllogism. In his humiliation, he is the same as in his exaltation, but the 1800 years, or if there were 18,000 of them, have nothing whatsoever to do with the case. Brilliant consequences in world history, which well nigh convince even a professor of history that he was God. These brilliant consequences are surely not his return in glory. But this is really about what they mean by it. It appears here again that they make out Christ to be a man whose return in glory can be nothing more than the consequences of his life and history. Whereas Christ returns in glory is something entirely different, something that is believed. He humbled himself and was swaddled in rags. He will come again in glory. But the brilliant consequences, especially upon closer inspection, turn out to be a shabby sort of glory, at all events entirely incongruous, about which faith never speaks when it speaks of his glory. Strange, and they went above all things to make use of history to prove that Christ was God. Are the consequences of Christ's life more important than his life? No, by no means, quite the contrary. If this were so, Christ was merely a man. There is surely nothing noteworthy in the fact that a man lived. Millions upon millions of them, of course, have lived. If this fact is to become noteworthy, the man's life must acquire some noteworthy distinction, which means that with respect to a man's life, noteworthiness emerges only in the second instance. It is not noteworthy that he lived, but his life exhibited one or another noteworthy trait. Among such traits may be included what he accomplished, the consequences of his life. But the fact that God lived here on earth as an individual man is infinitely noteworthy. Even if it had no consequences whatsoever, the fact is the same. It remains just as noteworthy, infinitely more noteworthy than all consequences. Make the attempt of introducing here the noteworthy distinction in the second instance, and you will readily perceive the foolishness of it. How could it be noteworthy that God's life had noteworthy consequences? To talk in such a way is to twaddle. No, the fact that God lived is infinitely noteworthy, and in and for itself noteworthy. Assume that Christ's life had no consequences. To say then that his life was not noteworthy would be blasphemy, for it is noteworthy all the same. And if anything need to be said about noteworthiness in the second instance, this would be the noteworthy fact that his life had no consequences. If, on the contrary, someone says that Christ's life is noteworthy because of the consequences, this again is blasphemy, for this life is in and for itself noteworthy. No emphasis falls upon the fact that a man lived, but infinite is the emphasis which falls upon the fact that God lived. God alone can attach to himself such great weight that the fact that he lived and has lived is infinitely more important than all the consequences which are registered in history. Okay, I think I'm going to be stopping there for the day. So that was part 2 of Training in Christianity by Søren Kierkegaard. I will continue to part E, a comparison between Christ and a man who in his lifetime suffered the same opposition from his age that Christ suffered. Okay, that's where we'll start next time. So I hope that you all are having a beautiful night, and I will be posting more soon. Thanks.